Hello, I'm Anultus, and today I want to talk about why free will can only be true if determinism is also true. So, a couple of things that I'm not trying to prove here. I'm not trying to prove that free will is true. I'm not trying to prove that determinism is true, although I do believe both of them to be true. I'm just trying to prove that free will can only be true if determinism is also true. So, essentially what we need here is a definition of free will. So, free will, I would say, a very simple and all encompassing definition that I think is amenable to most reasonable definitions of free will, is the ability to make choices. And what is the ability to make choices in relation to the idea of free will? What it essentially means is that when you make choices, and a choice being a value distinction, that is, you value one option over the other option, that this is something that emerges from your reason and from your internal reasoning and rationalization. That doesn't mean that all choices are reasonable, but that they come out of reasoning. Uh, I think that that would be a good description here. And that your reasoning is your own reasoning and not the reasoning of another person. So, therefore, the exclusivity of reasoning is very important for the definition of free will. Another uh, element to this is, in my view, the ability to make multiple choices is necessary for the ability to make choices. Not necessarily that one choice uh, is possible to be made, that more than one choice is possible to be made or achieved, but rather that there are multiple choices available for the mind to make, and that the mind reasons and values in between in order to come out with a conclusive choice, the actual choice that is being made. So, in that sense, the availability of choices is important for the making of choices, because if no choices are available, that is, if there is no distinction between different options, then there is no real choice being made, and therefore there is no will being exercised. And therefore, these different choices need to be available in order to be made. And I think that that is very important for the definition of free will. And I think a third criteria that I think is very important, that I think that a lot of people might disagree with me on, but I think that this is a solid conclusion to make. And this third criteria is that for a will to be free, it must not be random. And this goes a lot of against a lot of formulations of free will that attempt to utilize the idea of randomness to point out that free will is libertarian or independent of deterministic factors. And the reason why I don't think that randomness is a valid part of free will is because if we understand these choices as being choices that are being made, I don't think that randomness is really a choice. Because I would say that randomness is the same thing as not having a choice, but simply pretending that there are choices available because there is no actual reasoning factor going on. There is no value distinction being made. That is to say, that if these choices are indeed random, I don't think that that's any different from not having a choice. And I would say that observationally, I don't think that choices, human choices anyway, are random. Uh, and one reason I can say for this is because if your choices were random, then you wouldn't really be able to walk, or you wouldn't be able to walk consistently, that is, because your choices as for your movements would be all over the place because they're random. Or likewise, conversations wouldn't be coherent. So I would say that the randomness of human choices is counteracted by the coherence of human actions. That is to say that if our choices are what produce our actions, then our actions being coherent indicate that there is a reason behind our choices. And if there is a reason behind our choices, I don't think that our choices can reasonably be termed as being random. And another example is, for example, random number selection. You ask people to select a random number from 1 to 10, and multiple studies show that people aren't as random as you might imagine, that there are numbers that people are more likely to pick than other numbers. And that is because numbers are different from each other. And the difference in these numbers has an impact on people making the choice. Likewise, if you pick between two shirts that are, let's say, the same color, the same design from the same manufacturer, you pick these from these two shirts, and you might think that it's not really a consequential choice. You don't think that it is something that is something that requires a lot of thought to it, because they're uh, practically the same. But the fact is that they are not the same because they might be positioned differently, and their different positioning can impact whether you pick it or not, because people have handedness, people have superstitions, people have all sorts of different uh, habits and practices that lead to people distinguishing between these two choices in more than one way. And the fact that we distinguish between choices itself is necessarily important for a choice to be a free will choice, as I mentioned before, because if two choices are indistinct, then you're not really making a choice between two options if these two choices are indistinct. And I would argue that in any case where you can distinguish A from B, even if to you they might seem the same, being able to distinguish between these two indicates that to you, at least, that they are not the same, even if the only distinction is the understanding that these are two different objects, such as the two shirts mentioned before. And that therefore, this idea that human choices are random, in my view, is something that, if it were true, would contradict the idea of free will in the first place, but also that I think is not true as well. So, anyway, moving further along, then what does this have to do with determinism? Well, let's define determinism. Determinism has a number of different ways to define it. But I think a useful definition, at least for the purposes that we are discussing here, is that the future can be determined from the present or the past. That is to say, that there is either a something that is controlling uh, events that will happen, or that events naturally follow past events. That is to say, that if X happens, then Y happens. Or if X acts, then Y will be the recipient of that action. So, in that sense, you can utilize determinism naturalistically, or you can use it supernaturally, as many religions do. But in both ways, a good way to describe determinism is if X, then Y. And so, what does this have to do with free will? Well, a lot of people that argue for free will say that if X, then Y contradicts the idea that a will can be free. But I would argue that a will can only be free if X, then Y. Or if X, then Y might be a better way to phrase it. So that is to say that free will can only be true if determinism is true. And the reason for this is, in my view, baked into the understanding of what a will is and how a will is formed. And that is to say that if our choices are not random, then our choices must be caused by something that is not random. And the non-randomness of our choices are, as coming out of our will, as coming out of our ability to reason, is essential for, in my view, the definition of free will. But if we are reasoning and our reasoning is not random, then our reasoning, in my view, is necessarily determined. And I would argue that randomness, in my view, is the only way in which determinism could be false. And why do I say this? Because if something is not random, then it is necessarily caused by the intrinsic or extrinsic qualities of an object. So, for example, a human being has a nature, okay, and you could argue all sorts of different things about what human nature is, but there's lots of different philosophers talking about that. But as we describe a human nature, we also understand that there's human development, that there's socialization, that there's experiences that people have. And we can say that the intrinsic qualities, that is, the things that are within you that make you you, and the extrinsic qualities, the things that are outside of you that influence you, contribute to forming the choices that you make. They contribute to forming your values, and your values, your principles, will determine the type of valuations that you make. So, for example, somebody that doesn't like pumpkin is unlikely to order a pumpkin pie at a restaurant. Now, that doesn't mean that it's impossible for that person to order pumpkin pie, or that that person doesn't have the available option to order pumpkin pie, but that it is simply something that that person might not do. Now, if we then say, well, that's not deterministic. Right now, we're only talking about what somebody might do. That's not really the same thing as deterministic, as a deterministic statement that that person will do. And the reason for that is because in the example I give, I don't actually have enough information to determine whether that person will or will not choose to buy a pumpkin pie, perhaps to buy it for a friend, or perhaps because he wants to re-examine his tastes after some years where he might have had pumpkin a long time ago and he didn't like it, but maybe he thinks that maybe nowadays it'll be better. So in that sense, there's reasons why people who don't like pumpkin pie might choose to order pumpkin pie at a restaurant. But notice that these are reasons. So if somebody has no reason to order a pumpkin pie, then even though that person has the option available to him, he will not order pumpkin pie because he has no reason to do so. And that is a deterministic statement. Now, that being said, people might say, well, doesn't this violate the idea that people have more than one choice? The idea that for a free will event to happen, people need to make a value determination between two choices. But I say that saying that somebody's fundamental values are determined by intrinsic and extrinsic factors, in my view, does not contradict the idea that people are presented with choices and that people might seriously consider various choices. I just think that if we understand that people's reasoning is not random and that therefore it has a reason behind it, then the choices they make is necessarily also not random. And therefore, if you had enough information about the past, you could be able to predict the future. Now, that being said, I'm not saying that people necessarily always have a free will in every circumstance. For example, I would say that the boundary between the conceivable and the inconceivable is an example wherein people do not have a free will, because in order to have a free will in that instance, you would have to be able to choose to conceive the inconceivable, which is impossible, logically speaking. And therefore, it is something that you can't even take an action mentally upon. And therefore, you're not making a value distinction because there's no value distinction that you could possibly make, because there's no way that your mind could possibly conceive of something that it cannot conceive of, because that's a logical impossibility. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that something that is inconceivable for a human being is necessarily inconceivable for every being. For example, something might be conceivable to a mouse that might not be conceivable to a human being, just like something might be conceivable to a human being that might not be conceivable to the mind of a mouse. So in that sense, and then people could talk about God, but in that sense, uh, what I'm pointing out here is that if we assume that there's a natural limitation to the human mind, and that therefore there is a limitation to what is conceivable and what is inconceivable, um, then necessarily we would have to say that there are situations where people do not have free will, and this is one of the situations. The ability to overcome this unassisted is not something that anybody is capable of achieving. Now, people can attempt to that, and that is a choice that people can make, because it is something in their mind where they choose to say, well, I'm going to try to conceive of the inconceivable. Just like somebody can make a choice to sprout wings and fly, but the ability to actually conceive of the inconceivable is something that is missing from somebody whose conception, whose perception is limited. So, in that sense, I'm not making a full argument for compatibilism because that's not what this is about, but I'm simply trying to explain that if we understand a few things about free will, that is that we're, that when you're exercising a will, you're making a value distinction. That this distinction also requires you to have choices to make in between these, and that these choices are not random. Then I would argue that in the absence of another option, in the absence of the possibility of something that is not an intrinsic or extrinsic quality, that is also not random, which I think I don't think I have a category to describe such a thing. I'm simply describing. I'm What I'm saying is I think I'm describing something that cannot exist logically speaking. But in the absence of such a thing, then free will can only be true if determinism is true. And then I understand some people might say, well, that's not free will. And then you end up with the compatibilist, incompatibilist debate. But that's not what this is about. This is simply trying to make a point on the idea that free will can only be true if determinism is also true. So, anyway, thank you all for watching. Please tell me what you thought in the comment section below, or if you have any suggestions, feel free to donate on my Patreon in order to keep things moving so that I have time to discuss perhaps these deeper issues. So, thank you all, and I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltos over and out.